strata, and they get finer as they move to the top. And that's because the water deposits the materials horizontally by a process called leading edge grain distribution. So as the material is being deposited, the larger granules fall over the cliff of the front edge of the strata and settle at the bottom because they're larger and they're heavier. The lighter particles stay waterborne longer and settle out at the top. And that's why if you look at almost any given strata, and strata don't form vertically, they form horizontally. You can watch them in the laboratory in sleuth experiments in university where they'll actually create a sedimentary strata right before your eyes. And the sedimentary strata grows horizontally. So they don't settle down vertically. That could be a layer, but not a strata. A strata is produced horizontally by leading edge grain distribution. Imagine you have maybe I can explain it this way. Imagine you have a hill, okay, and it has a 45-degree angle at the right edge of the hill, okay. Now imagine you've got water flowing over that hill, and it's got various sized pieces in it, small ones, big ones, and really fine ones, right? As that stuff rolls over towards the edge of that hill, the big ones being heavier, they roll down to the bottom and they build up at the bottom, right? The smaller ones, being in the rapidly moving water, stay floating around in the water longer and they settle out slower, right? So what
God
this
isn't
does
the
is
real Among Us.
it results in the strata having larger particles at the bottom and finer ones at the top. And what this proves, the whole point of what I'm saying is, and then I'll be quiet for a while, is what this proves is the strata was formed very rapidly by moving water because it has particle size distribution, and the boundary between that strata and the one above and below it is thin, oftentimes paper thin. And that means there is no geologic time in between them. They all formed so quickly together, you might as well say they happened at once, almost at once. And so there is no imaginary millions of years to be found in the geologic column. That's a myth. Geology has overturned the evolutionist atheist uniformitarian idea that the geologic column proves the Earth is millions and millions of years ago. Think about this: where if the geologic column built upward over millions of years, where do the materials keep coming from to keep building up on top, on top, on top? Where'd it come from? See, you can't even answer that question. So anyway, the geologic column proves that God did judge the world, as Darth said, with the Noahic flood. He wiped it out, and it happened rapidly. There is no millions of years. It's a myth.
Okay, anybody want to add to that? Thank you, Neff. Anybody want to disagree? See, the problem isn't the quote unquote evidence. It is the interpretation of the evidence which is in dispute. But the interpretation of the evidence by the uniformitarianists, the old earthers, right? They present their interpretation of the data or the evidence as actual data itself.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Now, let me just give you a real quick example of how people have tried to attack the Bible in the Noahic flood. Okay. They'll say there's not enough water to cover the earth because water reaches its own level. And look how high Mount Everest is. Well, first of all, and Neff, you can jump in anytime. Okay. Actually, in order to flood the earth, okay, first of all, when it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, that was some of the water, but that doesn't have to be in the bulk of the water. The bulk of the bulk. Okay, so here's how you can flood the entire earth, wipe out everything without having the water reaching the same level and reaching the peaks of Mount Everest. First of all, they're assuming uniformitarianism that the highest mountain peaks were at their present height at the time of Noah, rather than those mountain peaks, the vast mountain ranges happened very rapidly due to massive geological upheaval that God used, probably in conjunction with plate tectonics, to bring about this cataclysmic result, resulting in massive earthquakes that are unimaginable to us today, causing numerous recurrent tsunamis, flooding each side of the continents. Once the water spills over onto the continent because of the tsunamis, it then seeks its own level. And then when more water comes in, that seeks its own level. So there's more than enough water on the planet through massive geological plate tectonics, earthquakes, and tsunamis to flood the continents.
That's correct. In fact, the mountains rose because of the flood. It was plate tectonics began with the flood. Secular geologists acknowledge that they don't understand how plate tectonics started. They believe, of course, that plate tectonics is true. By the way, did you know that plate tectonics, the very theory of plate tectonics, was first founded by a creationist, not an evolutionist. It was a creationist. But the secular camp, the mainstream geologists, they acknowledge that plate tectonics is a real process, but they don't know a mechanism that started it. They're scratching their heads. They admit in their own papers they publish in the geological journals that the mechanism for the initiation of plate tectonics is not understood. Why did the crust of the earth break up into plates and begin to move, and then one subduct under the other? They don't have a clue. They admit this. But the Bible describes why. It says that God opened the fountains of the great deep. And that is the mid-oceanic ridges that are on the ocean floor, and you can see them in Google Earth. All you have to do is open Google Earth and start looking at the Earth and see the mid-oceanic ridges that run around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The crevasses in the Earth's crust that go extremely deep, and that's where the water came from. That's where the vast majority of the water that flooded the Earth came from. And mountains were actually soft sediments that were squeezed and pushed up out of the surface of the earth during the flood. All of the mountain ranges of the earth were created in less than 1 year. Less than a year. And how we can prove that? We can prove that by pointing to the fact that the mountains of the earth possess folded strata, even recumbent folds, where the material folds back on itself in the same direction from which it came. Rock does not bend. At cold temperatures, like the surface of the earth, it breaks. It doesn't bend. It has to be soft like Play-Doh for that to happen. That could only happen if those sedimentary strata that were squeezed by the movement of the continents, the pressure built up in the surface, and pushed that material upwards, was still soft sedimentary material, all of it, still laden with water when it was contorted so that you have a mountain pushed up out of the earth with folded strata, because rock at the surface of the earth will not bend. It breaks. It would have to be 10 to 20 kilometers down inside the earth where there's enough heat for the rock to deform by what's called ductile deformation, right? Secular geologists acknowledge this. So they have a tremendous problem. How do you explain all the mountain ranges of the earth possessing folded strata, which are curved and bent every which way, when rock at the surface of the earth or anywhere near the surface of the earth will not bend? It shatters because rock has tensile strength only. It's got enormous strength. You can put a lot of pressure on a rock before it breaks vertically. But if you put horizontal pressure on a rock, it snaps. See? So this proves that the mountain ranges of the earth, all of them, formed rapidly. And that just kills uniformitarianism. And because of this alone, there are no millions of years, and there was no evolution. It's impossible.
Yeah. So Charles Darwin desperately needed to have a rationale that the earth was old and he was largely influenced by Charles Lyell, who hated the biblical account of the flood, and he wanted to argue against it, so-called scientifically. Now, once the theory of evolution spread like cancer through the scientific world and academia, then they drunk the Kool-Aid. Hey, it's a settled thing. The earth is eons old. Okay? So once something is dogma within science, that it is an overarching paradigm, they're not going to consider any ideas or information that's going to refute or mitigate it. These people are human beings. They have their own confirmation bias too. And they are wedded to an ideological retrodiction that the earth is old. They have to be committed to that. Otherwise, in their mind, evolution dies on the vine. Okay? So they're not going to consider any scientific analysis or rationales to mitigate against it. It's unthinkable to them. And people are duped because they're brainwashed in the school systems, in colleges and universities, and on television documentaries, because the old earthism and an old universe is dogma, and they're told, look, this is science. Some of the smartest people in the world all believe this. So what? It doesn't make it true. So when we were originally talking with Yanis, and Yanis objects, he doesn't take seriously that Judgment Day is coming and to repent and turn to Jesus Christ as his Savior, because he thinks that the Genesis account is ridiculous. Why? Because he's drunk the Kool-Aid, because there's a massive consensus that the earth is old. A consensus doesn't make anything true. All conclusions in science are provisional. Okay? You know, people say to me, well, the universe has to be billions of years old. Well, why? Well, do you know how long it takes light to travel? Do you know that the rate of change and time changes the farther you get away from objects of large mass? Okay? So the fact of the matter is, the speed of light as we understand it could be unimaginably faster than what we seem to be testing it at in a two-way back and forth, close to the sun and the earth, which are objects of large mass. Okay? So what people don't understand, they think that they're being given facts when it is only materialistic dogma. Right?
You know, one of the things that beguiles so many people is, and it's because the secular camp preys upon the logic of the typical human being is this. The secular camp claims that there was a star that exploded. This is called the nebular hypothesis. A star exploded, blew lots of dust and materials out into space that accreted into small rock pebbles, then bigger rocks and bigger, and eventually planetesimal than a planet, right? And became glowing hot. And that's what happened for the Earth. So that in what they teach you in school is that the Earth was once, in its early history, a ball of glowing hot magma that cooled down enough that we can live on it and that life evolved. Right. So now the any person's mind logically thinks, okay, if the Earth was once a ball of magma that was glowing hot, and now we can walk on it and there's trees and vines and everything, then obviously it cooled down. So how long would it take a ball of magma the size of the earth to cool down enough that we could walk on it? Their logic tells them, oh, obviously that's got to be millions of years, right? So that's how they hook you. Gotcha.
It's a few billion years.
They make you think, because of their fake story that the Earth started as a ball of magma and cooled down over millions and millions of years, people assume, oh, it's logic, and they're misled by their own logic. Because if it were true, that would be true. It would take millions of years for the Earth to cool down so that you could walk upon it. That's true. But the problem is the idea that it came to be as a ball of magma is not true. And that never happened. So people use their own logic. These people prey upon the logic of a typical human being to assume, oh, their story must be true. The earth is obviously hundreds of millions of years old. The Bible is obviously myth. It's wrong. It got science so wrong. Because they assume that the world, they believe the story that the earth was once a glowing hot ball of magma. And if that were true, it obviously would take millions of years to cool down to be where it is today so we can walk on it. Therefore, the story is true and the Bible is wrong and the religions are mythology and it's blah, blah, blah. See?
So,
That's
Mr.
how they.
Nephilim, if you want to deny the science and evidence that people using this logic
Jolly,
have,
jolly, jolly, jolly. All you're simply doing is you're arguing by generalization and cliche. If you would like to give me and Neff some specifics, okay, then we'll hear that. But I have one question for you, okay? Are all conclusions in empirical and scientific endeavors
I
provisional?
wanted to ask the guy a question.
I know, but this is my room, okay? He's been talking quite a while, and I will let him answer you, okay? But I'm asking you a question, okay? Are all conclusions in science and provisional and subject to change, revision, and complete refutation based upon a re-examination of the data or some future observation?
Yes.
Okay, so whatever you believe about that the Earth is old or the universe is old, it's a provisional conclusion, and it is not necessarily true. Are we clear?
Okay.
Okay, so whatever lines of reasoning you are going to juxtapose to Neff and mine's biblical view of young earth creationism, all you're going to be presenting are provisional conclusions. Now, do we agree that you will be presenting provisional conclusions and provisional conclusions only?
Sure. I just had a question for the guy.
Go ahead.
What's your evidence that the Earth was not formed over billions of years out of a ball of magma? If we have evidence to say that it was this way,
No, that's not evidence that it was. There's not evidence. This is a retrodiction. This is a materialistic explanation because they have removed God from the sphere of rational discussion as the creator, and they're only going to explain the earth and its contents and the universe in purely materialistic accounts.
So I
Can I
want to
say
know.
my point of view?
So I want to know what Nephilim has for
In a
evidence
minute,
it
Paige.
was
Go ahead,
a
Neff. Go ahead,
creation
Neff.
instead of
Well,
evolution.
there's massive amounts of it. I already explained one, the fact that the mountains ranges of the earth, all of them rose rapidly, very rapidly in a year or less because they possess folded strata, which destroys uniformitarianism. You see, by itself, this completely refutes the idea the earth is billions of years old. By
What
itself.
evidence do you have that the mountains were created
And,
this quickly?
and there's lots of other things. I mean,
God's
geological.
eyewitness testimony.
Apparently.
Well, I described it.
Well, it doesn't
I
make a
told you.
difference. Let me just say one thing. It doesn't make a difference. When you ask us, we're going to answer you according to our worldview. The fact that you may laugh at what we say is not going to change our worldview. So we have God's eyewitness testimony as to basically how old the earth is. Now, if you want to reject God's eyewitness testimony and God's role in creation and sovereignty, you have some big problems and questions to answer. Go ahead, Neff.
Well, I was going to say that the point I made about the folded strata in the mountains by itself refutes all of uniformitarianism. And if it refutes the idea that the geologic column is millions of years, takes all that away, then the Earth is young automatically. See, that destroys it. I already provided that to you. And you know what happened with it? It just went in one ear and right out the other. You
Can I
didn't
say my
pay
point
any
of
heed
view?
to it. You're
Go
just not
ahead,
paying
Paige.
any heed to it.
Darth Dick and Balls.
I will say this, though, the nebular hypothesis, this idea that a star exploded, strew massive amounts of space dust that accreted into rocks and got bigger and made planets. Uh, is fraught with problems. The secular camp admits, there are problems with this, problems with that, problems with the other. There's a myth that goes around amongst especially the secular camp that scientists have it all figured out. They know how this works and how the planets accreted, and they can show with science that this happened and that happened. The truth is, they don't. They admit problems with that. And I'll say this one thing, and I've been talking a lot. I'll be quiet for a while, but I'll say this one thing. Since the 1970s, scientists have been using vacuum chambers to experiment with accretion. That is the idea that space dust, which is infinitesimally small, which is what the star would have exploded and produced massive amounts of had there been a nebular hypothesis, a star that blew up and left its remnant is the core of it is what we have as a sun today. That's what they believe. And the rest that was blown out into space became our planets, right? That's their claim. So the problem, though, is this, is that since the 1970s, scientists have experimented with really high technology since the 70s. I mean, they had the technology to make these chambers and do these very same experiments almost precisely as well in the 1970s as they do today. Okay, and they were doing these experiments with accretion, and mathematics and physicists were applying their mathematical models to it and everything. You know what they discovered? Matter doesn't accrete. Space dust doesn't have a gravitational strength great enough to do any work. It has a gravitational pull of almost exactly nil, nothing. A tiny particle of space dust has a gravitational force of almost absolutely nothing. I'm talking about 0.000000000000001, something like that. It's not enough for one dust particle to pull another one to it so that they stick. And they shot little tiny pieces of rock towards each other at the speeds that they would have been moving when the star exploded, and found they either shatter each other or they bounce off. But they don't accrete. So the scientific experiments have left the secular camp scratching their heads. They can't make the models work. They've been crunching this stuff in supercomputers, in Cray supercomputers, since the 1980s. Never had it work. They used 1990s supercomputers. Still didn't work. 2000s supercomputers. Didn't work. 2010s supercomputers. It ain't working. It's never going to, because the physics doesn't support the theory.
Man, there's so many things wrong with what you just said. I mean, I'm glad we ran out of decades for you to use as an example.
Do you want me to tell you?
You're using a lot
do
of
you want
hyperbole.
scientific sources
Well,
for
Neff,
the
Neff, hold
fact
on.
that
Let
the
him.
secular
You're
camp
using a
Hold
lot
on.
of
I'm
You're
quiet.
using a
they
lot
don't
of
have a
Neff,
model
hyperbole.
for it?
I'm making a point of moderation here. Okay, Neff, let him answer. Now, sir, if you're going to generalize and generalize and generalize, you're going to be quickly dismissed. So if you're going to object to what Neff said, you need to give specificity.
Right. Well, that's my problem, is that you're using a lot of you're using a lot of hyperbole and generalizations. First of all,
what is your
scientists do not claim to have it all figured out. One of the first rules of science is you've got to be willing to admit when you don't know something. And the more we discover,
stop. Listen to me. Neff and I are grown-ass old men, okay? We don't need to be lectured about science, empiricism, evolution, geology like we're fifth graders, okay? You are not being informative when you tell us that stuff. So what I would like you to do right now is to tell us, what is your worldview, and what major belief that you have that you feel mitigates against any major belief that Neff and I have.
all right. Well, my view is that evolution is real. The Earth is billions of years old, and that, I was making the same point that you just made a minute ago, which is that broad generalizations don't work, and that's what I was hearing a lot from.
How is the Earth?
5 minutes.
Okay, how is the Earth? Now, listen to me. When I ask a question, I don't want you just to give me one sentence answers, but nor do I want you to give me a community college lecture. Okay. Now, how do you determine that the Earth is billions of years old?
I'm not a science professor. I don't have all the answers, but I don't respect somebody who says that, who makes a broad generalization that says, "Wow, scientists just, hey, they have it all figured out." That's not what scientists say. Part of science is admitting that we
No,
don't know
no.
things.
Okay, wrong, sir.
That's what
Wrong.
Neff said.
Like
Don't
Willy
tell me
Wonka
I'm wrong.
said.
This is what Neff said.
Willy Wonka said. Listen to me. Wrong. Just like what Willy Wonka said. Wrong, sir. Okay. The children are brainwashed in the American and Western civilization science classes that the Big Bang is pretty much a fact. That they're taught that it is a fact that the Earth is billions of years old and that the universe is 13.7 billion years old. They're taught that as a fact. Now, when I ask you, when you assert that the Earth is billions of years old, I said, how is that established? Then you go, well, I'm not a scientist.
Man,
okay.
Let me make one brief point about that.
Making this
about that. What the secular scientists acknowledge when they speak to each other or they write papers or books expected to be reviewed by their peers, they acknowledge their models don't work and they don't have it figured out. But what Darth is pointing out is that they tell students in school they got the answers and this is a fact. And that's
because these are the answers as we know them. And are you telling me that you're
hold on a second.
That's great dishonesty.
Okay, hold
are
on,
you telling me that this guy gets to sit here and make broad generalizations and you say nothing about it, but when someone wants to challenge those generalizations?
Jolly, did you say we know? Did you say the words we know?
I said as we know it.
As we know it. Now, I'm going to ask you a simple question. It's a basic question to the philosophy of science. Are all conclusions in science provisional?
Yes, I will quiet down a little.
Therefore, then don't say you know. What you should say, for example, is like what Leonard Susskind says, an internationally known and respected physicist in the class of Stephen Hawking. Leonard Susskind says, well, the current popular model is the standard model of cosmology. He was recognizing that this is a model. This isn't a fact. Okay. Right?
Okay.
Now,
I still think you're missing my point.
Good. I want you to give me some specifics that you're aware of as to why you believe the Earth is old, other than the fact that it has been drummed into your head by people in the science community and on documentaries that the Earth is old, the Earth is old, the Earth is old. Tell me why you believe the Earth is old.
All right. Do you give any respect to carbon dating?
Okay. Do you think that carbon dating rocks is a reliable method to determine the age of the rock?
Yes.
Okay, stop right there. What you just said is colossal ignorance. Carbon dating. Let me finish. Listen. Okay, please don't overtalk me. I have a lovely surprise for you, and Neff knows exactly what I'm going to say. Carbon dating can only be used on living things that have died, that have ingested carbon-14. Listen to me carefully. Listen carefully. Okay. Now, there might be, for example, carbon found in, let's say, coal deposits, but the coal deposits are formerly organic material. Rocks do not ingest carbon-14. Living things. Listen to me. Rocks are not tested by carbon-14. Rocks are tested by what is called radiometric isotope dating, such as uranium to lead, potassium argon method. They don't use carbon dating to date rocks. You see, because you're so uninformed, you have conflated carbon dating with the other dating methodologies. Now, are you aware of the fact that radiometric isotope dating methodologies commit circular reasoning? Okay. They have to presuppose that the rock in question is as old, if not older, than the putative parent element, right, from the daughter element. The daughter element is what is isolated in the rock. They then count backwards based upon the rate of decay to the putative parent element that's no longer there. Okay? And so you have to presuppose that the rock is at least as old as the putative parent element or older. Now, hold on. Do you want to dispute that is not circular reasoning?
Yes, you're going to tell me that this proven method, that this
No, stop right there. You said yes. Hold on a second. You just said yes. You're going to dispute that that's not circular reasoning. So they don't presuppose that the rock is as old or older than the parent element when they proceed to count backwards from the daughter element?
They do not use circular reasoning.
Okay. Do they presuppose that the rock is at least as old, if not older, than the putative parent element?
The answer is yes.
Can you answer that question, please?
And the putative parent element?
Okay, I want you to explain to me right now what is done in dating a rock. Can you tell me what they do in your own words? What do? They get the rock, and what do they do next?
They do a lot more than reading a
Shut up, human resources. Go ahead, Jolly.
Oh my God.
Oh, you see, he ran away like a little Girl Scout. Okay,
No,
he knew I wasn't talking to him. He was cornered by his own ignorance. He goes, "We know the Earth is old because of carbon dating." I mean,
well, it gets worse for them, Darth, because
I know, it's embarrassing.
Imagine that you have a rock that's 25 feet down, and then you have a rock that's 80 feet down, right? Now, we know that water washes radioisotopes into and out of rocks, right? It moves, and that's why governments report problems with uranium and other isotopes in our drinking water. It's a problem because water is washing the stuff out of rocks. Every time it rains, water seeps down into the
stuff is water
it washes
soluble.
it out of the rock. Rock is water soluble, except maybe obsidian, which is naturally made glass, right? So you got isotopes moving through rocks, right, into drinking water. So water washes isotopes into and out of rocks. So you have a rock that you find is 25 feet down, and then you have one that's 80 feet down. You date the one that's 25 feet down, and you think, oh, this is 1.2 million years old. And then you date the rock down that's 80 feet down, and you say, oh, this one's 18.9 million years old. But how do you know that? Because some of the parent or daughter isotope may have washed out of the rock that's at the top and accumulated at the one at the bottom. And that's why you're getting 18 million years old for the one at the bottom, because the one at the top is less. That's why it dates 1.2 million years old. See, they don't even consider that. It just doesn't even figure into the mind. Well, it's just, why should we think about that? It's nonsense.
Do you notice he laughed and he snarked when I said that radiometric isotope dating is based upon circular reasoning, and he said it is not circular reasoning. When I asked him to explain why it wasn't circular reasoning, he couldn't answer. And then when I told the other person to shut up for over talking him, he knew that this was his opportunity to pretend, to put on a show that he was offended as though I was talking to him, and then he ran away because he knew he was in deep trouble. He knew that he didn't know what he was talking about. He knew that he was no match for my understanding. Okay. And Neff and I disagree on some things, but Neff is vastly more educated on even those issues than I am. Okay. So this guy ran away because he knew that he couldn't defend his old earthism, but he held to it with such dogma. If you hold belief as absolute dogmatic truth, and somebody comes along and challenges that dogma, especially when that dogma is held in wide consensus throughout academia in the world, of course you're going to laugh at somebody coming along and saying, yeah, you're a kook. You know, when Einstein came along, many people in the scientific community thought he was a kook. And you know what? The only thing that started changing minds is when they had a solar eclipse and they could observe the starlight that was behind the sun in the eclipse, because the curvature of time space allowed them to see light from the star that was behind the sun, and it gave confirmation, or it was commensurate with Einstein's theory of relativity. And only then did it start changing hearts and minds. People need to wake up. The Bible says God will send a damning delusion to them that believe the lie, who receive not a love of truth. This is referring to the last days deception, when the Antichrist comes to power, possessed by Satan. But it says they believe the lie. Well, what is the lie? Well, when you go to Romans 1, the lie is that there's a mind shift, a paradigm shift in the world where you worship the creation rather than the creator.
Amen.
What's that?
Amen.
Yeah. It's
Romans
worshiping
1.
the creation.
Was that Romans 1? I think
Yes.
Romans 1.
Romans 1. When you believe in the Big Bang, an old universe and an old earth, okay, you are worshiping the creation. Okay? Now, granted, it doesn't strictly get you to atheism, but if you do believe that, that will provide the fertile soil by which you can remove God from the sphere of rational discussion. Well, we don't need to talk about some supernatural God and some religious mumbo jumbo. After all, we're men of science. You want to know how bad this is? Okay, and I'll be brief here. Neil deGrasse Tyson, famous astronomer. Okay. He's on more shows that you can shake a stick at, right? He's Mr. Science Man. He's also an atheist. He's the biggest proponent out there for the Big Bang, modern cosmology, evolution, and all that kind of stuff. Neil deGrasse Tyson says there's three kinds of truth, okay? There's objective truth, personal truth, and it's political truth. Objective truth is that somebody makes a propositional statement based upon scientific investigation, and it can be repeated anywhere else around the world using different equipment and different people and getting the same results. So the personal truth is just whatever you happen to believe to be true, and political truth is whatever the government or the powers to be that tell you. Now, Neil deGrasse Tyson says one of the most fascinating things that makes him smile and gives him joy is that we are all stardust. And then he smiles like the Cheshire Cat, and he says to the TV audiences, all the higher elements in your body were forged in the furnaces of stars. And when they exploded, then they reformed into planets. And then after millions or billions of years, the higher elements end in our body and we're stardust. That is not science. That is materialistic religion. Okay? Now, it may be true that some higher elements, other than hydrogen or helium, form in the furnaces of stars, right? But it doesn't follow that even if the higher elements did form in the furnaces of stars, therefore the higher elements in our body are the result of billions and billions of years. It doesn't follow. But it does follow if you hold to materialism and purely naturalistic explanation for everything posing as science. So Neil deGrasse Tyson has been passing off, foisting to his TV audiences something that he's presenting as scientific truth when it doesn't even pass his own test for truth. And I'm done.
Yeah, in fact, he says the matter in your left hand may have come from one star, while the matter in your right hand could have come from another.
That's not science.
I know that, but that's what he says, and I think that's an exaggeration of a point he makes that is so pushed so far that it's an absolutely outrageous attempt to indoctrinate people that you're a product of the whole universe, not just your local galaxy. It's truly absurdity, and it's just absolute espousal of a paradigm. Well, it's not actually science. It's a philosophy that you mentioned earlier. It's how people interpret the data, and that's absolutely correct. It's how he interprets the data transformed into philosophy, and his philosophy is supposedly scientific evidence. That's what I've discovered to be true about evolutionists, atheists constantly, is that they consistently consider their opinions about the data to be science fact, and that's what they tell you is true. And instead of allowing the data to actually speak for itself, they interpret the data, then tell you their interpretation of the data is the science fact, instead of what the data seems to imply on its face value. And I could provide countless examples of how scientific data completely contradicts evolution theory, for example. And yet the evolutionist looks at this and say, "Oh, that's because blah blah blah," and see, it's true. Evolution's true. See what I mean? Because they're interpreting the data in their own personal way. But if you examine the data for its face value, you don't get their interpretation, and that's the big thing. The modern world is expected to believe the interpretations, the opinions of the scientific community without looking at the data. They don't actually want you to examine the data and study it. They don't want you to. And that's one of the reasons that scientific journals charge money to be able to read the papers. They want to keep the public from reading the papers. They want you to be an academic to be able to read the papers. They don't want the general public to read the papers, because if they did, they would see this great disconnect between their interpretation of the data and the data they actually discovered and recorded in their papers.
Now, here's another factor to keep in mind. It's called confirmation bias. Once somebody accepts Darwinism, once somebody accepts the concept of evolution, which is a universal common ancestry, you are required to believe in the secret sauce. And that secret sauce, which is the lifeblood of evolution, is that there must be millions and billions of years, without which the concept of Darwinism as they conceive it could never bring about the changes in order to produce evolution. Now, the funny thing is, with the discovery of the molecular sequencing of DNA, even millions of billions of years, even upon trillions of Earth-like planets, through unimaginable number of trials, could never produce the coding sequences for DNA. It is so improbable from a probabilistic standpoint. It couldn't happen. Okay. Now, the reason why I say that is because everyone who believes in evolution, they all reason probabilistically. So by their own probabilistic reasoning, they have to throw evolution out the window. But you see, the old Earth and an old universe is a prerequisite. It is dogma, the secret sauce, without which even their Darwinism cannot survive. Okay? And which came first? A Darwinism or an old Earth that spread throughout humanity? Well, actually, it was Darwinism. Now, there were people advocating an old Earth like Charles Lyell, but once the theory of evolution spread and people began to believe it and say, "Wow, yeah, this explains it," then they're like, "Well, then the Earth has to be old." Therefore, everything they look at, everything they examine, will be interpreted in the light that the Earth must be, and has to be eons or billions of years old. This is pure confirmation bias. And this mentality throughout the world, okay, look how it has taken over in academia throughout the world. This is going to facilitate a one world government and the Antichrist. And then we're going to have the second return of Christ. Okay, that's simple. You know, the book of Revelation talks about that if you don't take the mark or beast, they're going to kill you. Well, if you don't like what I'm saying, what are you doing here? Okay? No one's putting your gun to be here. Okay? But you see, if you actually had a brain, right? If you actually had the, testicular fortitude, instead of heckling by snoring into the microphone, you'd step up to the plate and, like an adult, disagree. But you can't do that, can you? You could just snore into your microphone. because that's because you have little teeny tiny little miniature testicles. See, that's all they're left with, heckling into their microphone. Anybody have any questions? Anybody agree? Anybody disagree?
I have a question about your last point about the government and the Antichrist coming. I don't quite understand what you meant by that bit.
It says the Antichrist will be possessed by Satan, and he's going to stand in the rebuilt temple, and he's going to declare himself to be God. Okay, I personally think that he's going to do that, and he's going to declare himself God, and he says we're all God. I think they're going to get to a point where they crack the DNA code with supercomputers, that they're going to figure out how to prolong life, eliminate some of the diseases, and we're not that far from it. But the atheism does not always come with it with a banner that says this is atheism. There is no God. Atheism is just simply excluding God from the sphere of rational discussion in terms of the discussion matter. Because if God exists, or I should say, in the case that God exists, not if, because I'm a Bible believing Christian, then God is related to every subject, right? But if you adopt an atheistic outlook, even though you don't label it that way, you're an atheist for one reason and one reason alone. And I don't mean you in particular, I'm talking about anyone, is that if you simply exclude God from the sphere of rational discussion in the subject matter, that's atheism. And this is why the belief in an old universe and an old earth and evolution has become why it metastasized, and it's now held in consensus because people no longer wanted to retain God in their thoughts. He's just suitable for Christmas cards, people going to church on Sunday. Okay. There was a scientific paper that was written a couple of years ago, and it had nothing to do with creationism. And one sentence he said, and the guy made reference to the creator, and all hell broke loose. They were the editor of the journal, the peer review journal, was barraged with letters demanding that it be expunged, that the editor be fired because he referenced the creator. Okay, evolution is not science. Old Earth and the universe is not science.
Is that the paper that was published in China talking about the human hand? And they mentioned
I believe that was. I think you're correct. Yes.
Yeah, and they received hell for that. Yeah.
Now, granted, people say if you talk to a geologist or people involved, they think we're nuts. Well, of course it's science. So good. Well, let's talk about that. So don't you presuppose that the rocks are at least as old, if not older, than the putative parent elements? So what gives you a right to presuppose it's that old? Okay. And they'll say, well, we're not going to presuppose that it was made by God in 6 days because that's religion, not science. Well, then if you're going to reject something that's not science, you have to reject the very foundational parameters that you believe in order to make science viable, because you cannot justify those fundamental parameters by science. You cannot justify the reality of the external physical world by science. You cannot justify the uniformity of nature by science. You cannot justify the causal principle that it's global or universal. There's many things that you cannot justify by science that are fundamental parameters without which you couldn't do scientific endeavors.
An interesting thing about the book of Romans is where Paul wrote, they worship the creature more than the creator, who's blessed forever, amen, is that this was written not to the Ephesians or the Philippians, but to the Romans. And where did we get this idea of naturalistic cause for everything and the early forms of the evolution theory? Well, it was the Greeks. That's right. Democritus and Aristotle, and who else was it?
Some of the Stoics and Cynics and so on.
I can't think of his name. A prominent one. Anagnostus? No. Anyway, so yeah, it was the Greeks.
Oh, you mean
right?
Plotinus? Is that what you're talking about?
No. Anyway, I can't think of his name. So anyway, he was a prominent proponent of the early form of evolution theory in the Hellenistic Greek period. So notice that Paul wrote that to whom? The Romans, who were heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, right? Heavily. I mean, Rome was the place to be, right? It was the cusp of human civilization and technology was Rome. That was it. That was the epitome of man's civilization and technology. It was a brutal, filthy place, by the way. I mean, human, their entertainment was blood sport, for crying out loud, right? Humans pitted against tigers and bears and against each other. That was their. It was a despicable society, but it was the epitome of human technology at the time, right? They even had sewer systems in Rome under your floors, right? That was unheard of. Water clocks and everything. So Paul wrote this to the Romans because the Romans were heavily influenced by Anaximander. That's who I was trying to say. Thales and Miletus, Anaximander, and Democritus, and Aristotle, who put forth early forms of naturalism and even philosophical materialism and evolutionism, right? And so Paul wrote that letter to the Romans, who were heavily influenced by the Greek philosophy, right? It's just remarkable to me. Notice Paul didn't write it to the Philippians or somebody else. He wrote that they worship the creature more than the creator is blessed forever. He wrote that to the Romans. And he wrote it to those to who it was most pertinent. And I think that's an amazing, beautiful fact. Very interesting thing.
If anybody wants to disagree, you're free to do so, as long as you do it like an adult.
I was going to say, Neff, are you familiar with Feuerbach and like the left Hegelians and that, who were like preceded Darwin and so on in his like material determinism or dialectics and whatnot?
The whom? I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Oh, if you're familiar with like Hegelian philosophy and the kind of people who
Hegelian? No, I'm
Hegelian
not
dialectics, like material.
No, I know the early history of evolution theory. It started with the Hindu Brahmin, but I'm not familiar with this Hegelian thing. I have ignorance on it.
Darwin was very influenced by like the young Hegelians, Feuerbach and so on, who had these kind of
Darwin was heavily influenced by Charles Lyell, who took him under his wing when he got off the Beagle, and basically coaxed him to write a book about his discovery of the species. So
wait a minute. Did you guys know that Charles Darwin is a fraud? He didn't discover natural selection. Okay.
No, Aristotle wrote about that.
I know that. What I'm saying is, I'm talking about in his day. It was Alfred Russel Wallace who came up with the idea in its modern formalization, and he shared that with Darwin, and Darwin ripped it off from him and presented it as his own. Okay? Darwin desperately wanted to be a man of fame when he died. Okay? And he lied about the date upon which he had received letters from Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, to show you that what I'm saying is true, okay, Michael Shermer, who is an atheist and has a PhD in evolution, refers to Alfred Russel Wallace, you ready for this, as the co-discoverer of natural selection. Okay?
That's correct. Darwin published his book weeks ahead of his opponent, Wallace, because he and Wallace actually wrote letters back and forth to each other about their ideas. And Darwin learned some things about the idea from Wallace, and he took them and said, And Charles Lyell coaxed him, saying, "Look, if you can be the first to publish, you'll be the famous one." And and Darwin got busy, and he wrote his book in a relatively brief amount of time, and got it to publisher, and bam, he beat Wallace. And it was an ego game. It was an ego game going on.
By
It
the
really
way,
was.
if you want to have a better understanding of Charles Darwin, okay, there are any number of biographies around him, but they're pretty much hagiographies, which mean basically they glorify him like he's a saint. Go read the book The Dark Side of Charles Darwin. It's an easy to read book, and it's a very quick read, and it shows you stuff that is glossed over in a variety of biographies and things that are ignored. Okay, Charles Darwin is not the man people think he was.
The bottom line, though, about natural selection is that natural selection is not a creative force. By itself, it can't explain the idea of evolution. It's insufficient mechanism to explain the anatomical change that organisms have to continuously experience in order for evolution theory to be true. If the anatomy doesn't change, there is no evolution theory, because you can't get from the mite to the chimpanzee without anatomical change. See, morphological change, that is, change to form and structure, that is, the shape and size and color and pattern of things, is insufficient to explain evolution. Anatomical change is necessary for evolution to be true. And now, the problem with that is there's no mechanism for anatomical change. There isn't any. Geneticists have been studying mutation for 95 years, and they've never discovered a mechanism for anatomical change. Only deformities, weaknesses, and disease. So it's a myth. This idea that you've been pumped into your head, the evolution by mutation, and they tell you this on the internet, they tell you on TV, they tell you in school, that mutation is the base mechanism for evolution. And mutations to the DNA, changes to the DNA, bring forth a new anatomical feature. The stinger in the tail of a scorpion came into being with all of its incredible components. Incredible components, right? The sac, the muscles that contract it, the nerves that connect to the brain, the valve that holds it, the keratin incisor. All of these things came into being by natural selection acting on random genetic mutation as though mechanism. Natural selection cannot explain evolution. There has to be something underlying it. And so evolutionists, after discovering DNA, and they assumed that the mutation had to be the mechanism upon which natural selection acted to direct anatomical change. But 90 years of
How
studying
complex
mutation
does the anatomical
has
change have
proven
to be?
that mutations do no such thing. They only
What
cause weaknesses, deformity, and death.
What's your
Wait,
question, sir?
I was just wondering how complex the anatomical change has to be for it to be considered
Oh
valid.
well, first of all, do you know the difference between the genotype and the phenotype?
No, would you mind informing me?
Okay, the phenotype is expressed anatomically. Okay, the genotype is the genetic linear coding sequences that is mind-bogglingly complex. In order to go from microorganisms to human beings, you need between 2 and 3 billion base pairs of sequential programming information. Okay, the coding sequences just for proteins are extremely long. They're like very long biological molecular passwords. Okay. So if mutations are responsible for this, we can calculate precisely what has to happen down at a molecular level in a step-by-step fashion over many or long periods of time in order for the genome to build and then it result in the phenotype, meaning the physical output. Okay. So
Okay.
the odds of even the most rudimentary protein imaginable, let's say it's 100 amino acids long, if you had mutations within the genetic code to incrementally produce this, you're talking about at least at a minimum of 1 in 10 followed by 100 zeros. That's just for one of the most rudimentary proteins. Even the least complex cellular life has a multitude of vastly more complex proteins that would have to be coded for within the DNA. Plus, there's all the complexity of the regulatory code that is not coding for proteins also within the DNA. And so when you calculate the odds for each of these things, it becomes unfathomably and astronomically improbable. So from a probabilistic standpoint, there's no reason whatsoever to believe that mutations could incrementally build the genome, even if you factored in a trillion Earth planets.
Okay.
That's how unfathomably astronomically improbable the mutations to code for it would be, that even if you had a trillion Earth-like planets over 13.7 billion years old, it wouldn't even begin to scratch the surface in producing this. But you see, this is completely ignored. Why? Because they've already decided evolution happened. If Charles Darwin had known about the molecular complexity of the DNA, he would have thrown his theory of evolution into the trash. How do I know that? Because he said, if the fossil record doesn't bear out my theory in 100 years, my theory will collapse. Well, the fossil record still exemplifies stasis and not transition. All of the world's top paleontologists know this, and they admit this, like Stephen Jay Gould. So if Darwin was going to throw in the towel, because if the fossil record didn't bear out his theories, and here's what he meant by that: the creatures that we find in the fossil record, they appear abruptly and they disappear abruptly without leaving any trace of transitional immediate forms around them whatsoever. Okay? Now, if he was going to throw in the towel over that, then if he had seen the complexity of DNA, he would have just said, billions of years. You can't do it through mutations. But you see, they brainwash people in schools and colleges because with fuzzy thinking. Well, there are beneficial mutations. Yeah, but when have beneficial mutations ever been shown to overcome a frequency of error and increase complex anatomy and physiology that did not exist before? Even beneficial mutations
How
act
complex does
upon.
it have to be? Could it be like digesting a new
Oh,
material?
okay,
Substance?
okay. No. Here, think of
That
this.
won't change
Every
anatomy.
every
I mean, it changes
complex,
proteins,
listen,
right?
Gold, every complex feature that your body has, okay, right now, it all has to be coded for in a linear molecular structure. Okay?
That's not
That's
actually
how.
the case. I wanted to bring this up, but I'll let you.
Oh, it's not. So in other words, my spinal column right now was not coded for in the fertilized egg when I was conceived.
No,
There wasn't code for my spinal column.
Oh no, I'm sure that's the. Are you familiar?
Okay,
with
was there coding for my kidneys?
Yeah.
Was there coding for my circulatory system?
Yeah, of course.
Was there coding for the complexity of the human brain?
Yeah. All these things.
Okay, so every complex anatomical and physiological system, okay, it's so complex that medical doctors have to specialize in various fields, and even those have to specialize in those specialties, okay? The human anatomy and physiology is mind-bogglingly complex, and it all has to be coded for in a molecular coding sequence. Now, do you believe that random mutations could accumulate to code for all of these systems and overcome the frequency of error?
Oh, not in my view, not at all.
Okay.
The Bible actually mentions this problem.
Oh, sorry.
The Bible actually mentions genetics several times. It actually alludes to what Darth was just talking about fetal development from a book of information in Psalms 139:16. This, to me, is one of the top 100 passages in the entire Bible. It says this: "Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when there was yet none of them." In other words, this passage is saying there was a book of information that God had made that during his fetal development resulted in the structural design of all of his members. That's exactly DNA.
Well, let me just say this. We can't say that David was thinking of DNA.
No,
what
but the
he
Holy
but what
Spirit
he
was
did
given him
say
that.
is what it was commensurate with this idea. See, this is the elephant in the room, that all of the dogmatizing, the brainwashing that is going on in colleges and universities and in documentaries, nobody's discussing this. That it is as astronomically improbable as anything we could possibly quantify, and yet they still want to believe it. Yet they will turn right around and use probabilistic reasoning to believe that certain genetic code will be indicative of common descent, rather than it mutated by chance in terms of similarities between human and chimp coding materials. They'll say, well, it would be too improbable to happen by mutations. Well, so who cares if it's improbable, because you believe the whole genome happened in an astronomically improbable way. You see, they use improbability or probabilistic reasoning only when it suits them.
Probability becomes probability. Improbability becomes probability. In fact, there are properties to the DNA molecule that prove empirically that evolution is false and intelligent design is true. And these are them. The genetics, modern scientific discovery has proven that DNA is it's a four-dimensional package of strand hopping, forward and reverse reading, highly compressed, overlapping and nested information, which is prescriptive and functional, which operates with the human language properties of phonetics, semantics, punctuation, syntax, grammar, and apobetics, and semiotics, and operates algorithmically. Now, here's the thing: information, linguistics, and algorithms can only come from an intelligence. Period. There is no material causal ability to produce information, algorithms, and semiotics. It's
I don't
impossible.
disagree with anything you guys said.
So,
I was just wondering what you
this
guys
proves
thought about.
empirically that all
Okay,
organisms,
so
the DNA of all organisms operate this way. There is prescriptive functional information that operates linguistically and algorithmically, verifies scientifically. It's empirically verified that all organisms are a product of an intelligence.
okay, what
That's
did you
an
want to say, Goldshot?
unarguable fact.
I was just wondering if you guys had heard about like the so-called longest running evolution experiment and what your thoughts on it were.
Oh, are you talking about
Lenski.
Lenski?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's complete garbage to defend evolution. All that's simply showing is that you can have a beneficial mutation resulting in a novelty that provides something a slight increase in survivability. It doesn't show that the genome can grow vertically. Okay,
Well,
so
I don't really know what that means, but could I just say the last thing that I learned about this?
yeah, go ahead.
My understanding is that the E. coli, like they were gonna shut down the experiment or whatever,
Right.
and then the E. coli started to like eat the medium that it was in, rather than like the material that was put in there to like help it survive.
Yeah. So the point is this: is nobody disputes that there are beneficial mutations. A beneficial mutation is just simply a mistake that might produce a novel effect based upon pre-existing genetic material that might provide a slight increase in fitness or survivability. That in no way justifies that mutations can accumulate and build the genome. So I debated with some evolutionists the other day. I said, in order for evolution to happen, what is the mechanism that you're putting forth, okay, that will explain the arrangement of the information? And they go, chemistry. And I'm like, wrong. In between the ladders of the DNA code, okay, there's no chemical bond between one nucleotide rung and another. They're both attached to a sugar phosphate backbone, okay? But there's no chemical bond between one rung and the other. Now, there is a chemical bond between one nucleotide horizontally with the other side of the double helix. Okay. So you have two opposing nucleotides that match each other when the DNA splits in half, and then it can replicate itself. But each rung on the ladder represents a nucleotide of information and its matching pair for replication. But each rung on the DNA ladder chemistry is not determining the relationship between each rung. The only
I
chemistry
think
that.
what you
Go
said
ahead.
goes over their head. I
Okay,
think what
well,
you just said, I
okay, well,
understood what you said, but
okay,
I
all right,
think
go
it
ahead.
goes over their head. What Darth is saying is that if you examine one side of the strand of DNA, okay, there's no chemical determinacy that forces an A to be next to a C or a G or a T, right?
Mm-hmm.
Any one of those base pairs can bond to any site on the ribose sugar molecule that is the backbone of DNA on each
Mhm.
strand, right? So but for one is bound to the other on the other strand. Okay, so when you get to the other side, there's two sugar ribose backbone molecules with base pairs attached going along the DNA, right? So there's no chemical determinacy that determines which base pair has to be next to another base pair on any given either one of the ribose molecules, right? But on one side, one base pair is bound to the other type of base pair on the other side, right? By a chemical strand of molecules in between, right? So the one on the top has to uh, match a certain type of base pair on the bottom, and then you move over one, and the one on the top has to match a certain type on the bottom. But as for the top itself, there's nothing that chemically determines that any one of them it must be in its
Right.
place because there's no chemical determinants. Any base pair
Like
can attach to any location on the sugar ribose
That's
molecule.
why they
That's the
there's no
say
problem.
set pattern, you mean?
So,
no.
so
That's
the
why
evolution,
mutations are deemed to be random.
the evolution idea that the DNA molecule evolved is irrelevant because if there's no chemical determinacy as to which one became located at a particular order on one ribose molecule, then there shouldn't be for the other either. And so we shouldn't find even this parity. It shouldn't even exist. That's the point.
Sorry,
See,
the
everything.
disparity shouldn't exist.
See, what is happening is the dogma of evolution. Once it took off and spread throughout the world, it then became the filter, the sunglasses, the grid through which every other individual facts that they study would be interpreted. In other words, there will be no facts that will be interpreted to mitigate against Darwinism. Okay? Maybe on a small scale, but not on a macro scale.
Couldn't we look at
Darwinism has
experiments with AI?
no, that doesn't demonstrate it. Okay?
I thought it followed a similar principle in theory, at least.
No, because those are all okay. Those are all programmed. This is not chance. Okay, do you understand that every nucleotide that is adjacent to another that codes in long, very extremely long molecular strands within your DNA that codes for anatomy and reproduction, individual point mutations can have a cause, but the arrangement of every single nucleotide on the rungs of the ladder is deemed to be chance within the scientific literature on there. So it doesn't matter that they see. This is why they talk about natural selection, natural selection, natural
What do you mean
selection.
by chance in this circumstance?
Okay, okay.
You
If we take a
understand?
look, at the DNA strand, let's imagine it's A through Z to
Mhm.
grossly oversimplify it. Okay.
Yep.
Now, but we're talking about 2 to 3 billion base pairs. But let me simplify it in terms of 26 letters on the alphabet. Each letter represents a rung on the ladder of DNA, and it
Yep.
serves as information. And the accumulation one on top of another, or that one letter is adjacent to another, are like letters of the alphabet. It's like syllables, it's like words, it's like sentences. Okay?
Mhm.
Now, the arrangement of the individual units is not chemically determined. The arrangement of them is purely random. But you see, they don't emphasize this enough. It's
Wait, I
simply
thought they were.
glossed over. Let me finish. They
Sorry.
talk about natural selection, natural selection. All natural selection does is that when there is reproduction and some kind of variation, right, that the offspring, whatever that is, if it has more fitness because of certain environmental conditions, it is more apt to survive and reproduce and live on another day. Natural selection it selects for information that's already there. It doesn't. Natural selection doesn't produce new information. Okay.
Oh,
If
so
there's
like,
if there's a single mutation, good, bad, or ugly, okay, all natural selection would do would be it would retain it. But you see, they're trying to make you believe that natural selection is a creative force to produce the genetic information in the genome that drives the ever increasing anatomy and complex anatomy and physiology of the phenotype.
Yeah, it's worse than that. They want you to believe that natural selection selects only beneficial things and not non-beneficial. But numerous science papers have been published by secular geneticists that demonstrate that natural selection is constantly selecting negative mutations, and the human genome is decaying. And the rate of that decay demonstrates man cannot have existed
wait,
100,000 years ago,
negative
50,000
with
years ago.
respect to
The whole
what, though?
evolution theory is false. But back to the Zelensky thing,
That
I
it
wanted to say,
degrades the
I,
original
wa-
information that's already there.
I wanted to say this thing about the Lenski experiment. You mentioned that Lenski's experiment, they're talking about shutting it down. You know why? Because it's coming to a fold. The reason it's dying, they want to shut it down, they're talking about it, is because what they've demonstrated is that the mutations that the bacteria they've been experimenting on have caused the bacteria to become so specified in their needs in their environment, in this petri dish environment, where they're fed a sucrose as their only food source, that the only thing that these things can survive in is that environment. And if released into the natural environment, they die.
Wait,
That's it. They're
my
out.
understanding,
So what's happened is Lenski has pushed these bacteria to well over 50,000 generations of bacteria, and discovered that they've become, because of the mutations that they've incurred, that he thought would prove evolution. All that's been discovered is that they've made the bacteria colony weaker and weaker and weaker, and the bacteria colony is dying, and that's why there's talk of putting it into the
my
experiment.
understanding,
Your understanding is
Let him
wrong.
let him speak, Nev. Okay.
my
ahead, sir.
understanding with regards to the experiment was that it wasn't that the bacteria was bad at surviving in the conditions that it was set in, which I think was the goal of the experiment. It's that like their ability to get better at surviving in that decreased logarithmically, I
That's
believe is the way
exactly
they phrased
right. Limited environment. Exactly.
But
Highly
then
specified.
they didn't shut it down, or for whatever reason, because they hadn't gotten around to it. And then they were surprised because there was a jump, because instead of just eating the sucrose, it started to eat like the formaldehyde or whatever that like it was in.
Desperation. Yeah.
So it seemed like, and they looked
Trying to
back at it,
survive.
in my understanding, I could be incorrect here, is that
Trying to survive.
like there were multiple mutations that built on top of each other,
It's amazing a property of design that an
and
organism can
then it
do
started to eat.
extraordinary things
It
in
produced a new
a
protein so
last
it could eat
ditch
the
attempt
surroundings.
to try to survive. Amazing example of intelligent design. That
Here's
organisms can
listen.
do
Here's a
incredibly
philosophical diffuser.
difficult, crazy things as a last ditch attempt to survive. Beautiful.
Okay, if evolution is true, okay, and our biological systems and our minds are not God given, right, as the Bible teaches us, if evolution is true, then there's no reason to trust your thinking at all. This necessary and logically follows if evolution is true, but they don't tell you this. If evolution is true, then our current mental states, our mental dispositions, are simply the product of billions of years of cascading cause and effect. And what we think is good is just that the dominoes of molecular occurrence made us to think this way.
Wouldn't that be hard determinism?
Well, what do you think is going on in the sciences here when they believe in evolution? They don't believe that God designed humans. They believe it's simply the product of evolution. So what I'm telling you is, if evolution is true, it's chance and chemistry and physics, chance, then your mind is there's no reason to trust that you have reason. You
Could it be that
listen,
they're partly wrong and partly right?
listen to me. Why is it that my dog behaves the way it does and not the cat? How come the cat hasn't learned to bark? It doesn't bark like the dog. How come my cat doesn't behave like my dog? It
I
is
don't.
neurologically programmed to be that way. Now, why is it that we could have two puppies from the same litter? Why aren't they the same? Okay, because they're neurologically programmed to be different, even though they're neurologically programmed to be same in certain respects. The bottom line here is this: if your mind is not a gift from God, an endowment, because what is ultimate is in mind, and your mind is nothing more than the fizzing inside your skull of neurological occurrences, right? Going off and on of synapses in your brain, then there's no reason to trust your reason. Evolution doesn't select for truth. Okay? So, for example, what if certain human beings developed a mutation where they became slightly more paranoid? Okay? They would then seek to have advantage when they could and dominate over others. So eventually, they would survive more, reproduce more, and then eventually they would take over, and everybody would be mildly paranoid. But would their mild paranoia be rational? No. So if evolution is true, you can kiss your reason goodbye. It doesn't matter how successful we've been in scientific endeavors or in the amazing technology we produced. Okay? Evolution is a satanic deception masquerading as sound science. It's not. Now, when I say that, am I saying all of those people that are dogmatically teaching evolution in high school and college and on documentaries are purposely working for Satan? No. They've drunk the Kool-Aid. Okay?
Yeah,
They're a part of the dogma.
the truth is, if somebody who doesn't know what the truth is, and they believe evolution because they've been taught it, but they have an open mind, right, is presented with a plethora of evidence of creation from people in the know, they will convert. The reason people don't is because they're married to an idea that is opposed to the idea of God. If the evidence is so, I'm going to make a bold statement. The evidence is so strong, and so profound, and so great, and there's so much of it that if somebody is provided a fairly decent amount of this evidence, they will at the very least immediately come to question what they've been taught and what they believe, and their religious paradigm or non-religious ideas would change in accordance with that. That's how strong the evidence is. But people who argue vehemently that creation isn't true, that God isn't true, the Bible is not the inspired word of God, blah 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 blah. The people that do that, even after countless hours of discussing these things with Christians, well-informed creationists, intelligent design proponents like myself, like Darth, like others, like many and many, many others, and hear these things over and over and over again, and still say, well, I don't know, that's not true, and then blah, 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 they're right back in the debate room saying the same jargon over again. We can conclude the following about those people. They're not interested in the truth.
Well,
They're
thanks for the
married to the
conversation.
idea that God doesn't exist, and that's why they form everything they believe around this false idea that God doesn't exist because they don't want him to. That's what we can know.
Well, thanks for the conversation. Darth, there's someone in chat who I don't think has perms, but seems to have a question for you if you want to look at that.
Who?
Corvo.
Hello, sir.
Go ahead.
I remember a while ago you had a debate about evolution. It was a very good debate. I just don't remember the particulars. So my question would be, what is your best counter argument that you could help us equip ourselves for evolution? Like the whole spiel, like the whole argument, so we understand how to defend ourselves.
That God has given us his eyewitness account of creation, and it contradicts the interpretation of these highly credentialed, degreed, and really smart men telling us what happened a long, long time ago. If God's eyewitness account in the Bible is dismissed, it will be catastrophic for them metaphysically, because then they're going to have to explain the world from the ground up. And we're not going to be able to grant them anything. They're going to have to start from scratch. So when they start talking to us about biology and evolution, I'm going to say, "Oh, so you don't believe in God? You don't believe God created the world?" I say, "Good. How do you defend this? Okay, where do you get biology from? Where do you get these laws of nature from? Where do you get the causal principle from? What makes that real?" Right? Now, of course, there are some people who are theistic evolutionists, but these are compromisers. These are people who are intimidated by the dogma of evolution that has metastasized to all academic institutions. All right, and they're just compromisers, because the evidence for evolution is really not that strong. It's actually quite a crappy theory. It's really crappy, but people refuse to recognize that it's crappy because it's the only materialistic, mechanistic explanation in town. It's the only way to avoid acknowledging God as creator. That's why it's dogma.
Yeah, I remember.
I would
Dawkins.
offer this as well. That the modern 20th century technology discovered that DNA is a four-dimensional, strand-hopping, forward and reverse reading, highly compressed, overlapping, and nested information, a package of prescriptive and functional information that operates with linguistics properties of phonetics, semantics, punctuation, syntax, grammar, and apobetics, and also algorithms. And the problem is this, that information, functional information, linguistics, and algorithms can only be produced by an intelligence, which provides empirical evidence that all life forms were created by intelligence.
Right. So to augment what Darth said, there was a
Now,
quote.
to counter what I have to say, what I said, you must be able to provide an example of a naturalistic cause for the creation of information, semiotics, and algorithms. If you can't do that, then we're stuck with the creation count. Okay? So can you do that?
Oh no, I'm not arguing on that side, sir.
So wait, are you backing away?
No, sir, I'm not taking the argument, sir.
Is evolution? Wait, is evolution a science fact in your mind?
No, sir. No.
It's not.
No.
No.
I was asking Darth Dawkins to equip myself with.
I'll be right back. I have to return a phone call. I'll be back in a couple minutes.
Well, I hear you, but I mean, do you believe evolution is a fact? Or are you saying you seem to be arguing for evolution?
No.
Do you believe evolution is true?
No.
You don't believe evolution is true?
No. Not as
you
it's
believe
described.
in creation?
Well, yeah, I believe God created everything.
Oh, okay. All right. So you need to kind of change the way you operate, because you came across as one who is arguing for evolution theory.
No. I'm sorry if that came
Wow.
across.
Well, so refine your tactics or something.
Well, I didn't come in here with tactics, sir. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean,
I think he was just asking questions.
Yeah, debate tactic, bro. Like, what the fuck?
I was asking a
well,
question.
whatever.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I mean, be more precise or something. Because the way you came across sounded like you were supporting
Can I ask a quick question? Were we done with the previous line? I don't want to derail.
Well, the subject was the fact that DNA has been discovered to be linguistic, algorithmic, and
Yeah, I have a question along that line.
Okay, great.
You keep mentioning 4-dimensional. I'm assuming you're referring to some other. You're applying a dimension to some other character or property, not
Time.
necessarily a spatial dimension, right?
Time.
Okay, so you are applying it to time.
Time is the fourth dimension of DNA.
Yeah, understood. I'm familiar with.
Certain genes are expressed more during certain hours of one's life than others. For example, when you're sleeping, certain genes are expressed more than others are suppressed. Because that's the way the body functions. Certain genes are expressed a lot more while you're sleeping and others suppressed. So that's time. And it regulates during your day, So yeah, time is the fourth dimension of DNA.
It'd be the fourth dimension of most things, but agreed. I understand what you mean.
Yeah. That's why it's said that DNA is a 4-dimensional package of information. It's physically 3-dimensional. Here's one of the most amazing things about DNA. This is truly amazing. Truly. You're going to get a kick out of this. Do you know that DNA is supercoiled into chromatin so that it fits within the cell, right? Because the DNA molecule is 7 feet long, right? It's whisper thin because it's only, just a molecule, but it's 7 feet long. Now, to fit it within the cell and to manage it, the machinery of the cell, this is incredibly complex. I don't have time to explain it all to you. It relates to histones and histone codes and, how this all happens. It's mind-numbingly complex, right? How DNA is coiled, right? But imagine that DNA is coiled up like a rope, right? Imagine you have an 18-wheeler a mile down the road, and you've got a rope in your hand that's tied to that 18-wheeler, right? And so you have a spindle on it, and you begin to spin and spin and spin and spin, and the rope turns into knots and knots and knots and knots, and pretty soon it's all knots all the way down. Now you keep spinning, and that rope then doubles on itself, and it becomes double knots, knots upon knots, right? You keep doing this, you have to move forward towards the truck as you do it, but you keep doing it, and it becomes a coiled rope that in itself becomes coiled and coiled and coiled, right? That's what happens in your cells with DNA. DNA is a supercoiled molecule to compact all this incredible information into a package that can be managed by the cell, right? It's unfathomably complex, right? It entails histone molecules and histone codes. It's just mind-numbing, right? Scientists still don't know everything about it. It's so complex, right? But here's the crazy thing. Once that DNA molecule is supercoiled into chromatin, which is a super coiled upon coiled upon coiled rope of this thin DNA molecule that becomes much, much thicker because it's all coiled upon itself, it's coiled into a rope, which is then coiled into a rope and a rope, which are then coiled together to become a fat rope, right? That's how it deals with itself, right? That's how the cell manages DNA, right? But here's the cool thing. This is what I want you to think about. Once that happens, that the DNA is supercoiled into this super thick chromatin rope, right? There is certain information along the outside of that DNA molecule that is available to it. In other words, a polymerase machine can attach to that supercoiled rope and start reading down the side of it and get bits of data out of it that's not available when the rope is uncoiled.
That's crazy.
Please think about please think carefully about what I'm saying. This is mind-bending technology. Think carefully. When that rope is supercoiled into a rope that then is coiled to a rope to a rope to a rope, and it's super thick, right? Right? if you attach this polymerase machine on the outside of that supercoiled rope, it can run down the side of it, and it gathers information between base pairs that when that molecule was uncoiled would be miles apart. But when they're compressed, they provide a sequence of information that's critical to the function of that organism. That's what I'm telling you about intelligent design. DNA is not just evidence of intelligent design. It's mind-numbing evidence that the mind that designed this is so outside your box, you can't even think about how great the designer is. It's unfathomably genius. That DNA molecule, when it's completely uncoiled, can be read one base pair after another by a polymerase machine running down the length of it and get a protein. But then take that same string of DNA and coil it till it forms a rope that forms another rope, and then they form together into a fat rope, and then run a polymerase machine down the outside of that fat rope, and you get information that's only available to the machinery of the cell when it is supercoiled into a fat rope. That information is not available to that machine in the cell unless that molecule has been supercoiled. And that information is critical to the function of the organism. This means the supercoiling of the DNA information and the base pair that's right here on the DNA molecule and the one that's 19 miles down the DNA molecule when it's uncoiled are critically important, because when it's supercoiled, one is going to be sitting right next to the other. So it can be read.
Nephilim, you're quelling up right now, dude. Can you stop that?
Do you understand the unfathomable complexity of that?
You need to stop quelling up and chill out, dude.
That's what I'm trying to point out.
I know you're trying to do that, but you're quelling up real bad.
The package of genetic information is so incredibly complex, and these are evidences of intelligent design that is so overwhelming that when people who deny creation learn about them, should become creationists almost immediately. Anyone who doesn't is not doing so for an intelligent reason, for an intellectual reason. They're doing it for an emotional reason. They just don't want to believe.
Hold on, let me just take that point. There we go. So, what's the argument for that?
Yo, dude, you're on fun.
Sorry, what?
You are not funny.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, and you're wasting water for doing that.
That's not wasting.
Dare you?
That's not wasting water. I put a bunch of shit in there. What are you talking about?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
His name is literally poop.
I presume. Wait, let's argue this. Either toilet has shit in it or it doesn't. So we need to have
a Nephilim-freeze arguments in there. So there you go.
I assume that means that you find them to be ridiculous.
And your worldview.
So,
what's your worldview?
Mr. Poop.
We don't care about that.
So, Mr. Poop.
What is your worldview? Why are you scared to state it out for us?
No, I want to ask you a question, good sir, Mr. Poop.
Well, if you just tell me your worldview, I'll answer your question.
Yeah, we need to know your worldview.
Oh, I get it.
Mr. Poop, are you taking a certain line of reasoning and argumentation?
Asking you clear, circumspect questions.
So the question is this: How could natural selection cause the ordering of the DNA molecule when it's uncoiled?
Okay, nephew, we'll play Monopoly later.
From the left all the way to the right to be a series of base pairs, right? That when supercoiled into coiling upon coiling upon coiling into a superchromatin rope, when read by the outside of it by other machinery, produces information. You see, the point is that The base
It's gonna be all right.
the base pairs of the uncoiled information had to coincide with the supercoiled information
I
in
want to
order
hear
to
more from this
provide
Mr.
the
Poop guy.
information. You see what I mean?
We can
Critical
play
information.
later.
And you have to
I wanna
believe
know
in the
guys'
most
worldview.
unfathomable, incredible miracles to believe that that's even close to be considering possible. Right?
Well, hold.
So anyways, what's your worldview?
Yeah.
Well, what's the other guy's worldview?
I think this is one of the greatest scientific evidences that life was created.
It's okay.
I have never heard a refutation to it.
We understand. We understand. So, other guy, what's your worldview?
So, do you have an argument?
I do.
Can get special tags.
Okay. So please
I want
explain to us.
Ukrainian.
Please explain to us how an uncoiled natural selection.
Was it coiled up to begin with?
How can natural selection create an uncoiled DNA?
So was it coiled?
And then create a super, because evolution posits that the DNA molecule got longer and longer and longer because of evolution. So it started out uncoiled, according to evolutionists.
Right. So it was coiled up and then it went uncoiled.
Right. So how did the base pairs, the arrangement of the base pairs, provide their specific information when read horizontally, right? And then how did those base pairs, provide specific information when the molecule gets supercoiled, relating to base pairs that are way the hell down there?
Can you provide evidence that DNA exists?
Oh my God.
Yeah,
Okay, so you're done. You're done.
Are you dodging his question?
So I just want to note that you have no
think he might be,
direct
Spectre.
observational. Excuse me. You have no direct observational evidence. Excuse me.
Anybody who says, "Can you prove DNA exists?"
Excuse me.
Hold on.
Let
Mr. Poop.
Seriously, we're done.
Go.
You're done, sport. Okay, move on.
Yes, sport.
Sport.
Did you have any direct? Excuse me.
Hang out with the 12-year-olds or something. This ain't
Well,
it.
you know what?
It's on Discord already. That's where we are.
Do you have
Please
any
stop
direct?
interrupting
Excuse
Mr.
me,
Poop.
do you have any? Thank you. So listen.
Are you telling me that molecules exist?
Dude,
Come
let
on,
Mr.
man.
Poop
I don't
talk,
believe
man.
that.
Let Mr. Poop talk.
This guy's an animal.
Jeepers.
We need to uncoil you, Mr. Nephilim.
Are you telling me there's such a thing as biology?
Can you prove that molecules exist?
Wait, does this guy have a voice changer?
Sir, Mr. Nephilim, I know you're an old gentleman, and you understand what's going on. But
I actually like.
Actually, I'm 326 years old.
So Mr. Poop,
God.
Mr. Poop is
Merlin.
doing something to you that's called trolling. He is.
No, he's
engaging
not.
in-
No,
He
he's
is
not.
engaging in
No,
a
He's
trolling.
making a
not.
statement on the ontological claims of science.
Do you have
So
any direct observational evidence that I'm trolling?
I mean, even
well,
if you
first
had
of all,
Yes,
your
direct
name
observation,
is
DNA
You're
exists.
Poop. You're either trolling or
It's,
you're not
No,
trolling.
it's a
don't
French
entertain
name. It's a French
Either
name.
trolling
Don't
or he's not
entertain.
trolling. Yes,
No,
correct.
he asked me if
So what's the
DNA actually
hypothesis?
exists. So don't entertain. Just don't talk to it. Anybody who says, "Do you have
I want to hear
evidence
more
that
from him.
DNA exists?" Don't talk to
I
him.
want to hear more